Welcome to TDP Premium, your home for premium content from the Dead Prussian podcast, brought to you by Hollow Street Media.
We've covered propaganda on the show quite recently. In fact, we talked about Nazi propaganda. We've talked about narratives of war, some of our earliest episodes, particularly with Dr Sharon Maskell-Dare, on narratives and how people remember wars. And war memory is interesting, particularly as we see a conflict occur. Now, many of us have seen different conflicts over the past couple of decades. I know a lot of my listeners are people who fought in the wars on terror, I suppose, if you're going to call it anything. And, you know, it's interesting, that particular conflict. There are many people that forget that the West, we lost. But what about war narratives as they're happening? G'day listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, Mick, the humblest host with a podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. Now, I really appreciate all the support as we're finally back. As you can tell, I'm on a bit of a bent this year. I'm fixing a few problems I've had with the show. We now have a premium Apple partnership now, so that listeners who want bonus content, want to listen ad-free and get some extra access to some of our archives, you can do that by signing up through Apple. For those listeners on other platforms, I am investigating other ways to do that for you. It's just the easy way to do it with Apple. It tends to be how Apple rolls. They make things a little bit easier, not necessarily better, but easier. So if you want to subscribe to our premium channel, go to your Apple Podcast app and click the button just under the title on your app. Thank you also for the reviews, listeners, and welcoming us back. It's been a slow 18 months, but I can tell you we have some very fascinating guests coming up. Just like today. My guest today is Dr Jade McGlynn. She's an author and a research fellow at the Department of War Studies, King's College, London. Her research focuses on Russia's war against Ukraine since 2014, propaganda, memory politics, and state-society relations in Russia. Jade, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Jade, before we discuss your research and your book, recent book, I mean, it came out last year, but it's recent to me, so your recent to me book, Russia's War, I'm really keen to find out what motivated you to become a war studies scholar.
Well, really, I guess it was the war. It was Russia's war on Ukraine in 2014. I've always been a Russianist. My research focused on Russia in a sort of more area studies way. But I moved to Russia, in my view, sort of forever in 2011. And I was working then in 2014, and I became appalled, but also, I suppose, from an academic point of view, quite fascinated by the way that the Kremlin was using, in particular, the memory of World War II, or what they call the Great Patriotic War, to justify aggression against Ukraine in 2014. And then I went off and did, research projects and a PhD sort of looking at that topic, but also how it fitted in, I suppose, to Russia's understanding of itself within the world, to its understanding of history, to its understanding of its future. And then when I finished my PhD, I had a lot of research that I felt was really important, but it didn't quite fit, say, within, the academic strictures and theoretical framework. And also maybe because I didn't really want to admit what it was showing me, because it just seemed so obscene. And then with the full-scale invasion, the start of the big war, it became very clear that it was obscene, but that's what it was showing me. And I mean, of course, it was a very difficult time because of friends in Ukraine, but I had also just had a baby 2 months before the invasion, so there wasn't really that much physically I could do, and I felt like writing the book would be a contribution to explaining, because you need to understand the Russian view if you want to come up with, or mainstream Russian views if you want to come up with informed policy. And it kept me sane. So in a way, it's this topic. It's the war that brought me to war studies.
Now, there's a few fascinating bits there, particularly you just had a baby, so you're like, oh, I might just write a book as well. I didn't even give birth, and I still use having kids as a reason to be lazy. Now, Jade, it's a fascinating perspective, right? Because people will hear your accent, they'll understand that you're English, and quite often what we see, and this is very true in Australia with Australian observers, is a lot of the observations of things like the Russian-Ukrainian War, except for a very few observers, it's from afar. But that's not where your perspective comes from. You're a scholar who has lived with the people going through this. So the title of your book, Russia's War, gives us an idea of the main topic of your book, and you've kind of given us a basis for where your perspective comes from, which is both as a scholar and also a human who's lived it, right? But I want to try and get our listeners to buy your book and read it, because I think it's a very, very important book for people to understand, particularly at this point in history. So can you give our listeners a little bit about what your book is specifically about in relation to the current war in Eastern Europe? And you're not allowed to just say it's about Russia's war, because that's in the title and we already know that. So a little bit more detail on what's it about with the current war.
Well, uncontroversially, I suppose, I'm arguing that the way you tell a story, at its most basic, I'm saying the way you tell a story is going to influence its reception. So the first part of the book is about the core Russian narratives about the war since 2014, and then especially with a focus on most of it is sort of focused on the here and the now, the post-2022 phase of the war. And I look at the narratives, but also how they're mediated, how they dovetail, and how they diverge. And it's important to understand, I'm talking about narratives. There isn't one sort of hegemonic narrative. And of course, I also look at Russians' reactions to the war as part of a shared human experience in some cases, or shared human psychology, but also within the peculiarities of Russian history, society, and politics. So the first half of the book is about the narratives and the case for Putin's popularity and propaganda's success, even if perhaps neither of those are really quite as they first seem. For example, propaganda doesn't work by convincing everybody, especially not in a country like Russia, where the population's actually quite cynical due to the Soviet years and often very capable of reading between the lines. Nor does it work by persuading them that this or that event is true because of this or that fact. It works by reinforcing people's emotions and prejudices, by confusing them so that they think there isn't really any truth, objective truth. And so they fall back on sort of what they know or feel is true, e.g., my life has been better since Putin came in, or my life has been worse since the Soviet Union collapsed. And then as well, that's just for some people. For other people, it will work by making them think, well, everybody has a point. There's, I don't know what's going on. The phrase is in Russian is "не всё так однозначно," like not everything is black and white. And if you think that, then maybe you should just stick with your own side, right? Because the West is against you anyway. Or alternatively, maybe you don't agree with it, but what is the point in saying anything? Because the propaganda is everywhere and you're the odd one out, you're the weirdo who's against the war. So why say anything? And sometimes it might work. Propaganda works by encouraging just one of these reactions. Other times it might provoke a mixture of responses. And so my broader argument is that the Russian government, and I think we'll get into this in later questions, but the Russian government, it's not about mobilizing widespread popular support, but more about manipulating a sort of public acquiescence to the war by stressing the evil, disruptive role of the West, or the impossibility of knowing the real facts, so that even if you didn't believe the propaganda, it won't necessarily mean that you believe the Western narrative, and much more likely you'll probably find some kind of alternative or hedge between the two options. And I think that rather than pretending the cure is as simple as sort of fact-checking, sort of information versus disinformation binary, that if we want to engage or change Russians' views, and I'm not sure that's a fruitful activity, but well, let's leave that aside, we need to address the sources of why people wanted to watch that propaganda, because they do have a choice. They had a choice in 2014. There are lots of sources, and they have a choice now on Telegram. It's completely uncensored. And yet most of the popular channels, Telegram is a Russian messaging app that many people use to get their news. Around 50 million Russians use it actively. every month. And most of it's completely uncensored, and the most popular political channels are all pro-war. So then that leads us to the second part of the book, which is, okay, but why do people want to watch this? Because watching propaganda is a symptom of an underlying problem as much as it is cause of further problems. And I think rather than, I want to sort of, what I do in the second half of the book is interrogate why the pro-war messages resonate as they do. So I guess I shift from what Russians are watching to why do they want to watch that in the first place? And so I draw on sort of course, on interviews, on my own ethnographic research, first-hand analysis of Russian society, but I basically unpick their, I suppose what one might call sort of a resentment, but also a desensitization that underpin Russia's especially aggressive form of patriotism and its denigratory attitudes towards Ukrainians, its sort of mix of a superiority-inferiority complex towards the West and cults of perpetrators. And I'd say for me, both half of the books are essential to understanding why Russians approve of their country's war against Ukraine.
That's an excellent lead into my first question, getting down into the weeds. You touch on the fact that, in the West, there seems to be a delineation, right? And this is something that I've noticed in public discourse, and this is a very Western approach to seeing things, right? We tend to say, we have leaders say, we're not against the Russian nation or the Russian people, we're against Putin and his war machine, right? Now, from your research, is it as clean cut as that? Is that type of commentary that we see, or do the Russian people see this as their war as well?
I think I want to just pick up actually on something in your question, because that approach, particularly say by British or American politicians, really annoys me, because so it's not against the Russian people, and you think, okay, well, that's a lovely statement, but I imagine they probably think that you sending lots and lots of weapons to the guys fighting the Russians is more meaningful. They may take more meaning from that. So I also think it's a bit pointless, but in any case, to answer your question, I think Western-based discussions of the Russian information space, and especially public attitudes in Russia, not just to the war, but also towards the Kremlin, they tend towards very unhelpful binaries. So you would easily form the impression that Russians are either these sort of bloodthirsty, virulently supportive of the war, or that they're heroic resistors or would-be heroic resistors who, if they are silent, that is imposed only by a Stalinist terror. And of course, there are people in both groups. Of course, there's plenty of them. But they're really very far from being representative of the whole spectrum and gamut of opinions. And I think that this sort of binary model that's sadly taken over discourse around the war and around Russian attitudes towards the war, I think it's simplistic. I think it's decontextualized. And I think it actually engenders what I would call a really infantilizing approach to Russians, as divided between those who are sort of enlightened and know the Western truth, and those who are too stupid or too brainwashed or innately imperialist to see it. Reality is more complex than that. But as I hopefully show in the book, most people in Russia will not perceive the war or the Kremlin in a black and white way. And state-aligned propaganda, so that's media that's supportive of and constrained by the Kremlin, but not necessarily state-controlled, it's sensitive to this. And you don't have this totalizing approach that tries to turn audiences into true believers, but it's more about nudging different audiences into different acceptable, I suppose what I might call like information outcomes for the authoritarian Russian state.
Now, you mentioned, binary and black and white approaches don't help. Now, I'm looking at my questions here and thinking, geez, I wish I knew that before I wrote them. But I'm going to keep going along my path because I'm going to prove a point about Western thinking. So one question many of us have, and why many of us, I've got a production team of 2, but I'm just going to say I speak for a lot of people, even though I haven't canvassed them.
On behalf of the Korean nation.
Well, I'm actually going to speak on behalf of all Westerners here. And it relates to support for the war, right? And so the second half of this question you've kind of answered. I'm going to chuck it in there anyway because I took the time to write it. But there's been lots of different terms we've seen coming out of Russia about labels for the war. So do the Russian people see it as a war, and how does that affect how they support it?
Yes, Russian people see it as a war. I did around 60 interviews for this, and they were not just random interviews. They were also based on people that I'd been in conversation with since 2014, and that I sort of used to track different parts of the population who were broadly supportive of Kremlin foreign policy, but very much not in the same way. And of those people, none of them used the term special military operation to describe this. One even laughed and said, "It's all right, you don't have to call it that. It's a war. Let's call it a war." And a very, very pro-war person. The only person who didn't was a very famous analyst, or at least famous in Russia and the US, called Dr Jade, and his responses were very careful. So yeah, I think he's a bit of an outlier, I guess what I'm trying to say. So yes, people see it as war. Even on state television, you will see influential people call it a war. For example, Fyodor Lukyanov, who's very close to the Kremlin and whom I also interviewed. But sometimes, and even state media will call it a war. Sometimes that war is a reference to, it's almost as if there's a special military operation within the war. So the broader war is against the West, right? And all of the nefarious evil that Russia presumes the West wants to do to it. Whereas the special military operation is something specific to Ukraine. I mean, that's in the real kind of state language, but I think broadly this is very merged. I think the debate around Russian support in the war, to be honest with you, it sort of becomes a bit of a zombie debate in the sense that it often focuses on how many Russians support the war. In a way that, I mean, what's the okay number then? Okay, if it's 49%, then it's okay, but if it's 51%, no. And I think, firstly, there are a lot of issues with doing polling in a country like Russia at the moment, although perhaps not as many issues as some people make out. Polling is still useful; it just can't be our only, gauge. And I think more importantly is, I think this whole debate around how many overshadows more analytically useful and also meaningful investigations of the different ways in which Russians view their war on Ukraine. So
it's good. I'm going to change my thinking to how do Russians support the war?
Then
you can actually say none at all, right? And it's fascinating the element of the special military operation, which it's a laughable term. Because, I guess some of us spent 20 years in special military operations.
I mean, to be fair to the Russians, I mean, we have the Troubles in the UK, which is also quite a twee term.
Yeah, the Troubles makes it basically like so much more endearing than it is, right? Like the Troubles was not endearing, but it's just a bit of trouble over there.
There's a kerfuffle going on in Northern Ireland.
So I went to an Irish Catholic school here in Australia, and it's amazing how much the influence of the Troubles were in the school. And we only had one Irishman in our school. But still, it was still drummed in through the culture. So I think euphemisms aren't something that are not known in the West. It took us a long time to talk about the war in Afghanistan rather than the conflict in Afghanistan. And not everyone in the wider public believes they're synonyms, right? People think a conflict is not nearly as bad as a war. But one thing you talked about there was this, the macro sense of the war of Russia against the West. And, during the Cold War period and perhaps at other points in history, I mean, Russia, I think, this is my own perspective, Russia shifted against the West the most during the post-World War II era. I mean, I think they spoke French in the aristocracy for a long time, right, until I guess until there was no aristocracy. That's a euphemism, ladies and gentlemen.
They had a bad turn in 1917.
They had just a bit of a change of focus. But the concept in Soviet propaganda of being at war with the West, right? And we've talked about this. It's not just I guess for people in the West we see it as propaganda, but it's not. It becomes a reality, right? Because it becomes a mindset. So, the war occurring in Ukraine was previously, Ukraine was a Soviet state, not traditionally part of the West. So it's fascinating. Is the at war with the West message, has it been resurrected, and does it hold sway in the minds of Russians in relation to Ukraine?
I think, I suppose, I'm so sorry to do this, but because otherwise I will rightly have Ukrainian friends annoyed with me. I think if we say sort of not traditionally part of the West, perhaps I think that's true if we're talking of Russian thinking. I'm not sure it's necessarily true historiographically or in terms of how Ukrainians think of themselves, because obviously what is now modern Ukraine has been divided, was previously divided. So, around half of it, or like the western part of it was, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example. So there are different traditions, but I certainly take your point, but I just wanted to make that clarification so as to not unduly annoy my Ukrainian friends.
That's good. I've got Ukrainian friends too, so it's really important that is clarified.
Yeah, let's not annoy anyone's Ukrainian friends.
Because I'm going to get smacked up the head, yeah. So that's great.
So to come back to the question, I think if we're talking about, there's this idea of the collective West and also of like Anglo-Saxon, so like Anglo-Saxons, which always makes me giggle a little bit, even when it shouldn't, even when they're threatening to like nuke Anglo-Saxons, because it just makes me think of like Ethelred the Unready or some sort of like Anglo-Saxon.
Right. So everyone forgets about the Normans and the Danes and everyone else who lived in England, right?
yeah, exactly. But in any case, the idea of it, I suppose the core element is that Russia didn't start the war in Donbass in Ukraine, but the war was actually unleashed by the collective West, which organised and supported what they view as this unconstitutional armed coup that brought in 2014 in Ukraine that was an effort to start a genocide against the people of Donbass. And as such, the collective West is the direct instigator and the culprit of what is happening. And this is something Putin repeats again and again and again, and has repeated in various ways since 2014. But it's also, it is about the West, but it also speaks a lot to their understanding of Ukraine, which is that they just do not give Ukraine any agency. And so the idea is that Ukraine is but a vessel, and its only sort of agency is to be able to choose which great power it's in hock to. And clearly, in Russia's view, that should be Russia. And this is something that's in major doctrines, it's in broader political rhetoric. As you point out in your answer, it of course feeds on a Soviet language and a Soviet positioning that is not necessarily, I'm not suggesting that all of this is just language and rhetoric and completely divorced from reality either, but we'll keep it, that's sort of a broader question. But yeah, and I think actually understanding this and understanding in particular sort of Putin and the people around him that are influential, their view of the West and the ideas that come out in their major doctrines and their sort of broader political rhetoric over the last decade at least is important to understanding how the war can end and how the West should respond as well. Because the idea is, and you can just go and read this in the 2021 National Security Strategy, you don't have to take Russia's National Security Strategy, you don't have to take my word for it. The West is on its way out. It knows it's fading, its power is fading. And so in its death throes, it's becoming more aggressive. And this will only hasten its demise, which it deserves because it's sinful and hypocritical and aggressive towards others. But in that demise, it will become more dangerous. And I guess they would cite, in their view, Western kind of pushing of Ukraine, Western aggression in Ukraine and arming of Ukraine as an example of this. But they see it very much as a waiting game. And Putin and Russia, they're confident that they can outweigh the West. They are confident they care more about taking and subjugating Ukraine than we care about defending it. Mm. And I have to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure that they're wrong. But I very much hope they are, though, and I would do anything I could to make sure they are. But they're different things.
Well, that's a concern that Zelensky's raised himself.
Mm-hmm.
That don't lose your attention, and you see it. The Ukrainian ambassador here in Australia talking to the government quite a lot. So it's Yeah, and there's a lot of engagement. In Australia we have Ukrainian academics who are Australian citizens, but they're mobilised. I met someone last year who was doing their own. They had their own supply chain of sending supplies over to Ukraine, not military supplies, clothing, perishable, non-perishable foods, those sorts of things. So it's interesting to see the different pockets. I think those sorts of community-led events within Western countries might help prolong the attention span with it. But there are those of us who have we saw how focused the world was on Afghanistan in 2001, and then when we pulled out of Kabul, people were like, "Oh, well, we're still there." So it's one, and I'm not saying the conflicts are the same; they're very different conflicts, but the attention span is the same. And when we talk about attention spans, I have two different types of attention spans in my audience. I have the freeloaders who just download the free episode that we produce and listen to the ads and don't get premium content. And then I have the other people who I call legends, who pay for premium subscriptions and help keep the lights on. And the lights on are very important in the studio because I'm recording this at midnight in Australia. So, one, props to me for staying awake. Not true. Jade's fascinating, so she's doing a great job of keeping me awake. But also, it's always good to be able to share something with them that I don't get to share with the freeloaders. So right now we're just going to have a quick pause and we're going to go to the premium content question. And we're back from our premium question now. I know to the freeloaders it felt like we were only gone a couple of seconds, and I've got a couple other questions for Jade, and you're going to get your money's worth, which is zero money, I'll remind you freeloaders. But that was a fascinating answer to the question. I must say it was actually a very good question. I wrote it myself. But it was a fascinating answer, and it was one that is asked a lot in the media, but just is never answered in depth, and the complexity is very rarely put forward. It may also be because there's a lot of people out there who don't have the courage to answer questions like that because they have to make sure they've got another article coming. But I'm sure if any media people are premium subscribers to this show, they might say, hey, that's definitely someone we need to get on our show to talk about it because no one else is giving us such a nuanced understanding. Hopefully that's spurned a little bit of interest in our freeloaders to convert them to premium as well. And I'm going to leave that in there so they know that was my intent. Jade, my second to last question, or I used to call it the penultimate question when I was being very fancy on this show a few years ago. But my penultimate question, before we get to all the important final question of each episode, which is the same, and it's inspired by a Prussian guy that fought with the Russians, actually, signed up with the Russians because he was a bit upset with his own nation's response to Napoleon, but we won't go there right now. What I want to discuss is the cost of the war on the Russian population, because this is something I think that will confuse some of our listeners, because understanding that Russians may not have the perspective that a lot of them thought they did when they downloaded this show and before they started listening. But we have seen some horrific casualties on and numbers on both sides. Horrific casualties on both sides, and you can't keep away from it. There's, it's horrible stuff, right? And you're seeing a lot of graphic images. Mm-hmm. We've seen Russian prisoners be conscripted as mercenaries and sent to their deaths in large numbers. But how does the Russian population react to casualties and the cost of war in terms of the human cost?
So there are two points to this. I think first of all is maybe I can use something anecdotal to I suppose bring the data part of it alive. But so if I speak to my friends who are, and I have kind of similar friends or acquaintances in Russia and Ukraine in terms of, I suppose, their makeup, because I met them sort of through my academia, sort of journalism, I don't have journalist friends in Russia for obvious reasons, but you know what I mean. As in, like, they're educated, etc., like sort of, I suppose, middle class, whatnot. In Ukraine, they all know somebody who's died as a result of the war, is serving in the war, is fighting. Everybody is basically involved, and the impact is felt, especially when you get further east for obvious reasons. In Russia, that's very much not the case, and that's deliberate, because whilst a lot has been spoken about in terms of the focus on different ethnicities, i.e. non-Russian, non-Slavic Russian ethnicities, in the sort of efforts to mobilise people into the army, They haven't actually used conscripts yet. That could be a next step, but it's loaded with a lot of danger for Putin. They have focused on the poor areas, on the rural areas, and that's what we see if we look at the data, the sort of the demography, I suppose, of mobilization, is that they very much avoid the big European cities where A, there's more protest potential, but also B, people have maybe the money to buy their sons out of it, right? Yeah. And so that's one important element, is that the sort of people who would be more likely to, I suppose, revolt against this, the sort of people, or protest against it, or, react in some kind of politically coherent way, as we might see it, they are not being targeted. The state is doing everything it can to avoid them. And that was one of the reasons why Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, went to the prisons. That's now been stopped, actually. Or the MOD has taken over, rather than it's been stopped, as opposed to the mercenaries. But yeah, so that's a deliberate effort, and it's part of a deliberate policy, I suppose, of demobilizing, of making it feel like the war is far away and it's not impacting Russia. It's not really impacting people, because I think the Russian state understands. I mean, they pay a lot of attention to polling, and I think in the presidential administration, they understand that people are not keen, and we saw this in September with some of the protests. People are not keen to go and fight in it. I mean, it's one thing to sort of agree with or go along with a war, and it's another thing to go and die in it. But the second point I would make is that within this, I guess you also need to think about, and I think this is the human psychology part, because I remember there was an interview of a woman whose son died in the early days in the attempt to take Kiev, and they spoke to this as sort of, there was an interview that I watched with her, and she said, I don't really understand what the war's about, but I think that my son died as a hero. And I think about this interview a lot, because and in Russia, many young men do serve in the army, because obviously there's conscription for a year. Those conscripts don't go to the front at the moment, but there's a lot of links with the military. The military is very present, much more, say, than in UK life, for example. And you're asking a population to choose to believe a narrative that, their sons, their husbands, their fathers, their brothers are war criminals, or part of an essentially genocidal invading army that have committed terrible, terrible crimes. And that, they've been looting, they've been stealing people's hairdryers and washing machines left, right, and centre. They've behaved disgracefully. They've been raping people. They've been raping women. You're asking them to believe that, and then if their son is dead as well, you're asking them to believe they didn't die as a hero; they died as a villain. That's a lot to ask of somebody psychologically, especially when there's another narrative that's much more prevalent, telling them your son died like a hero. Your son died just like the Red Army in 1944, fighting fascists. I mean, just as a mother, I can certainly tell you which narrative I would prefer to believe.
Yeah, and that is a excellent point to finish on, because I think that puts it in a perspective that most of us can understand. And I guess from the male population point of view, how would you rather be remembered as well? And so you believe that about others, because you hope that if, there but for the grace of God go I, the same sort of things would be said, right? So that's fascinating. I've learned so much in this podcast. I always learn so much from my guests. That's why I get smart people on, and I just ask questions, black and white questions. But Jade, we're coming to the final question on the show. Now, this is one that all guests ask. No, it's not. They don't ask it. I ask it. It's one that all guests answer. It relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible and continue the conversation and debate around war, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. So I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So, Jade, can you please finish the sentence? War is.
War is when people from one area, country, in some sort of organised fashion, go to kill people, to conquer people in another country. And I think it's important that war is killing. Some of the talk around hybrid war and information war, I don't want to be dismissive of it. It's very important. But sometimes it can distract and equate that with what is ultimately the most dreadful thing to do, which is to kill innocent people.
I love that definition. I love that definition because I hate euphemistic terms like hybrid war. My listeners have heard this a lot. Grey zone conflict, hybrid war, information warfare. Some of these, I didn't like it when I was a professional military officer. And I was in roles that used a lot of those. The other thing I really hate is kinetic and non-kinetic effects. No such thing. It's lethal or non-lethal, destructive or non-destructive. But I'll never convince anyone otherwise because PowerPoint slides rule the world.
Yeah.
Jade, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been absolutely fascinating understanding the nuances, learning about the nuances of Russia's war.
Thank you. Thank you very much for an interesting conversation.
Now, listeners, thank you very much for supporting the show. If anyone's offended by any of the jokes I've made throughout the show, given the seriousness of the topic, feel free to write to the show. I won't read the emails, but you can write through. Just don't give me a low review on iTunes. Give us a high review. If you want to give me a low review, just don't review us. It's the same effect, really. Please follow Jade on Twitter at Dr Jade McGlynn. McGlynn spelt the normal Irish way. And also support Jade by buying her book and getting your head into this fascinating topic. It's published by Polity. It's in the show notes, a link to Amazon. If you buy it through us, we get an affiliate fee. Now, the good thing about that is we don't take money out of Jade's pocket. We don't take money out of Jade's publisher's pocket. We take it out of Jeff Bezos's pocket. And his pockets are really, really deep. So please, if you're going to buy books, buy them through our Amazon links in the show notes. Finally, if you want to know more about Jade, jump on her website, jademcglynn.com. It's got all the details of her previous publications. She's got a book coming out soon, and there are a heap of articles, both media articles for people like me that can't understand academic language, and then also academic articles that you can follow up with. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/The Dead Prussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is a Hollow Street Media production. It is hosted and produced by Mick Cook and co-produced by Brooke Winnell. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Hollow Street Media.